Hello, this is Todd Booth, and this will be a presentation on Network Security Essentials. Today I'll be covering Chapter 12, Firewalls. And firewalls can be an effective means of protecting a local system or network of systems from network-based security threats while at the same time affording access to the outside world via wide area networks and the internet. And the way you can do this is you can have a network-based firewall, and that can protect all the systems on each side of whatever networks it's connected to. And you can also have host-based firewalls where, for example, on Windows clients, you can have a firewall on each system. There's advantages of both, and my recommendation of the day is to use both of them. Have network-based firewalls and also host-based firewalls. They don't have an overlap of all the features. If you have both, you're going to have a better security solution. So go ahead and pause, and you can read this opening quote. The need for firewalls. Information systems in corporations, government agencies, and other organizations, including LTU, have undergone a steady evolution. And the following are notable developments. We now have centralized data processing systems with central powerful computers supporting a direct number of connected devices. We have local area networks, and they're interconnecting PCs, terminals, surf pads, everything, also via wireless, and they connect to the main center. We have premises networks consisting of local networks interconnecting PCs, servers, and perhaps larger systems. We have enterprise-wide networks consisting of multiple geographical distributed premises networks interconnected by a private wide area network, and we can use this solution for LTU with all the different campuses from Kiruna, Piteå, Luleå, and Skellefteå, and connect them all with wide area networks. We also have internet connectivity on all the locations, and this internet connectivity should be available to not only employees and students, but it should be available to visitors. And when the visitors come, we put them on a different subnet, but we have to think about how we can protect ourselves from the visitors as well, while at the same time we give them internet connectivity. Moreover, individual users within the organization, they want and need internet access 24/7 and from wherever they are, either in their office or in a meeting room or as they travel in different places, the cafe, for example. And if it's not provided via a local area network, then they need a wireless attachment, so we need to provide that. And when we provide the wireless attachment, there's more security issues because anyone can try to hack into those wireless systems. And the internet access provides the main benefits to the organization. It also enables the outside world to reach and interact with the local assets. So we connect to the internet to give our local users outside access, but then outside, the hackers are going to try to get in through the internet, through the firewall if there is one, into the organization. And we of course want our own students and employees to be able to travel outside the organization and to connect back. And the way we do that at LTU is with a VPN. We have VPN software that will let students and staff get into the network from remote locations. And it is possible to equip each workstation and server on the premises with strong security features such as intrusion detection and prevention. This may not be sufficient and in some cases not cost effective. And there are some issues if we try to have a solution with every workstation where we put on a firewall and intrusion protection system, because they might disable it momentarily. Do we want to lock up their machine? Even if we want to lock up their machines, what if they're visiting with their own notebook or surf pad or mobile phone? So we want to have both device solutions and network-based solutions. And therefore we have to have scalable configuration management because it does get quite difficult. And we have to have aggressive patching, and the reason for that is so that as soon as these vulnerabilities come out, we quickly patch with new software to eliminate the new vulnerabilities. So the solution is defense in depth. We'll have our network-based devices for firewall and IDPS, and then we'll have our host-based solutions as well. So it's the firewall that provides an additional layer of defense, and it insulates the internal systems from external networks. And defense in depth is a very important feature in the design of any security solution, and it does work very well with firewalls. So what are the characteristics of a firewall? Well, all traffic from inside the organization to outside and vice versa needs to pass through the firewall. Otherwise, the firewall can't control things. So it's achieved by physically blocking all access to the local network except via the firewall. So the firewall might have an internet connection, and then it'll have an internal connection. The internal connection could be to a variety of connections to subnets. It could be an 802.111 wireless to get to some devices. It could also include 802.1q, where it's running multiple VLANs on the same cable, and then we can go to a switch and split it off. But it's basically in between the internet and the local. Now we can also have firewall between our own internal networks. And what the firewall will do, if you configure it properly, is implement your security policy. It's only going to allow authorized traffic as defined by the local security policy. So up at the top management, we create these security policies, and then it's the low-level technical people that implement those, and one device to use to implement those is a firewall. And there's a variety of different firewalls which can be used, and they implement various types of security policies, and we're going to go over that. Now, the firewall itself is immune to penetration. I mean, we try to make it hardened, it's called, and what we do is there's no services that are enabled which it doesn't need, and it has very limited access, and you can configure it so that you cannot manage it from the internet side. You have to get into the internal side to manage it, and they're very well designed for that purpose. So the alternative, like at home I have a server 2012, and if I fire that up and put it on the internet, then a lot of hackers can try to get into it, and by default the server 2012 has all kinds of services open, and then the hackers can try to take advantage of those. So for example, what I do at home is I take my 2012 server and I disable the internet side, and I force it to go through my firewall, my own Cisco ASA, and that way the only way to get to my servers through the ASA, and the ASA is going to block off everything except the specific ports that I allow it to access to go through to the server. And even then on the firewall, I say if I'm going to try to come in and remote access my 2012 server from the internet, what I do is I tell my ASA firewall, don't allow anyone to come in with port destination 3389, which is remote access. Don't allow anyone to come in except from this IP address, which is my office at LTU. My office at LTU, I have a special IP address, and therefore at home I only allow that IP address to come in to remote control my server. And we have to think also about service control, and that determines the type of internet services that can be accessed inbound or outbound. And in my last example, one of the services would be remote access. Another example would be DNS. I have a DNS server at home on my server 2012, and if I want to make that available via the internet, then I have to open up another port. And I can pick and choose what ports I open up and close, and that's what you do at the firewall. So it's the firewall that can filter traffic on the basis of IP address, protocol, or port number. And it may provide proxy software that receives and interprets each service request before passing it on. And that proxy service can require users to be required to authenticate, to provide credentials. And if they don't have the right credentials, they will not have access. And we have what's called direction control on firewalls, and that determines the direction in which a particular service request may be initiated and allowed to flow through the firewall. We may only allow service requests coming in, or maybe for other services, only services going out. And we can apply those service rules to the inside of the firewall for local users, or the outside of the firewall on the internet side. Firewalls also have behavioral control, and that controls how particular services are used. For example, the firewall may filter email to eliminate spam, or it may enable an external access to only a portion of the information on the web server. And what I do on my ASA at home is I can also first I'll analyze the traffic coming in, and if it's including files that are being downloaded, I save them to the ASA, and then I can run a filter on those and look for malware. And then if it's not malware, then it can go ahead and go through to the end user at my home. So that's an example of a feature of a firewall. So what are the firewall expectations? And before we proceed to the details of firewall types and configurations, it's best to summarize a little bit of what you can expect from a firewall. So here are the capabilities. It's a firewall that defines a single choke point that keeps unauthorized users out of the protected network, and it prohibits potentially vulnerable services from entering or leaving the network. And it provides protection from various kinds of IP spoofing and routing attacks. Now, the IP spoofing is you might have a bunch of local private addresses within your organization, and what these hackers do is when they try to come in through your firewall, they're going to use a source address of your local private network. They're trying to spoof and trick it. They should only provide an internet address, but they use a local address to try to crack your network. So what you can do is on your firewall, when you see traffic coming into your network with a source IP address of one that would be within your network, your firewall can automatically filter it, and that's what I do. And it's very easy to set up on my Cisco ASA. And this idea of a single choke point simplifies security management, because all of the security capabilities are consolidated on a single system or set of systems. The only way to get to my home devices is through that Cisco ASA. And that's what I mean by we consolidate all the traffic through a single system. Now, it's the firewall that provides a location for monitoring security-related events. Audits and alarms can be implemented on the firewall system. And for example, in my home with my ASA, when I have different events that happen, I send them automatically to my Windows Server 2012. And what I do is I have a Radius server set up, and it's set up for accounting, and then it can keep track of accounting events that come from the ASA. And those could be any type of events, problems with the ASA firewall, or it could be just denial of service when people try to get past my filters, etc. It could be events like my daughter is logging on to different websites. And you can have that put into a text file, or you can have it in an SQL database, those log entries. And if it's in an SQL database, you can easily do queries and look at different events. And one thing I want to point out is when you have this firewall and you're doing accounting, it's really great to have accounting, because then when you have an issue, you can look back in time over the past few months and see if you had the problem before and just didn't know it. Now, a firewall is a convenient platform for several internet functions that are not security related. Now, the firewall may also have network address translation features. Almost all of them do. And what they do is they map local addresses to internet addresses. And the idea is you can have one public address, and you can share that among 10 or 20 or 30 machines in your local organization. You don't have to have a public address for each machine. Plus, via this NAT function, you have a little bit more security as well. It also has a network management function that can audit or log, and what I do is I have that information sent to my Radius server and it gets logged, and I can look at the information anytime I wish. Now, another reason to log that I like to log on my server 2012 is if hackers somehow took over and controlled my firewall, they could delete the logs. But if I have the information logged to a separate server, even if they took control of my ASA and crashed and burned it and delete all the log files, I'd still have all the log files on my server. A firewall can serve as a platform for IPsec. Now, IPsec allows you to have encryption over a connection. So you can use IPsec with VPN tunnels, and from a client I can VPN from anywhere in the world to my home, and it uses IPsec to do the encryption. Or I can have a site-to-site network. So I can just have a permanent always-on connection between my home and, say, my sisters in the US, and then that connection is always going to be on. And what's interesting about that is I don't have to have the VPN client on my different PCs at home. If I have a site-to-site from my VPN server, which is also the firewall, to my sisters, then all of the clients at home, at my house, can use that tunnel without having any special software. Now that comes in handy when at home, some of our devices, we want to access some TV shows and other information, and they normally block you if you're outside of the US. So with a site-to-site tunnel, I can go through the tunnel and then I can see these different US TV shows, and they think I have a US IP address. Okay, well that takes care of firewall expectations. Now we also have a couple of limitations, so let's talk about those. Now the firewall cannot protect against attacks that bypass the firewall. So internal systems may have some kind of other access to connect to an ISP. Let me give you an example of that. Let's say you're at work and your company, when you try to go through their firewall, you can't do anything. You're like really stuck. You're on your PC, you're at work, and you just can't get through the firewall to do anything. What would you do? Or maybe what would a bad person do? Well, a bad person would take a USB stick with a SIM card, and they'd plug it in their USB port, and bingo, they're now using their work computer to go via the internet via, for example, Telia, one of the ISP providers which provide mobile phone internet access. Or maybe they're going to go to some kind of Wi-Fi station that's close by and get around the company. So by bypassing the firewall, everyone at the companies, by putting in a USB dongle and surfing with their SIM card, they can go ahead and bypass the firewall and get to the internet. Now the problem is, if their machine's infected, then all these machines on the internet, all these hackers on the internet, can go through that same connection, get to the person or employee or student's PC, and by the way, the PC is also connected to the corporate LAN, and then they can go through and they can attack the corporate LAN. So you might be wondering, oh, that's not good. How are we going to stop that? It's called lockdown. At least that's what I call it. So if you lock down the machine, you can configure it so that they cannot put in a USB dongle and surf away somewhere else. But you really have to make a decision in an organization. Are we going to lock down all the devices or not? If we don't, then we have to think that we're going to have these attacks. If we lock them down, we're a lot safer because we're forcing them to go through the firewall to get to the internet. And if you have an improper secured wireless LAN that may be accessed from the outside, then we may have hackers come in through that. So you got this wireless network, everything's great, but what about if the Wi-Fi signal goes outside of the building into the parking lot? Before the people even cross the guard gate, they can sneak in through that wireless network and attack from within, and that they're bypassing the firewall once again. And you might have a laptop computer which is company issued, and they take it home, and when they're home on the internet, it gets infected, and what do the next day? They come to work with the same laptop and it's infected. So that's another way we have to watch out, that they can bypass the firewall. And the solution again is lockdown. You want to lock it down so that even if they go at home, they're forced to run whatever anti-malware software you have as your corporate standard. Okay, we've got a nice figure on different types of firewalls. Now we have a packet filtering firewall, and that's applying a set of rules to each incoming and outgoing IP packet, and then it forwards or discards the packet, or maybe logs it, or maybe it captures it, so you can see it on Wireshark. Now the firewall is typically configured to filter packets outgoing and incoming based on different rules and restrictions. And the filtering rules are based on information contained in a network packet. Now, a lot of different information in the IP datagrams will be looked at. It might look at the IP source address or the IP destination address. It could look if it's TCP traffic or UDP. It might look at the port numbers. It might look at the protocol field. It might look at the interface of which it's incoming or outgoing. It might look at just the outside interface where traffic is incoming. It might look at the interface outside where traffic is outgoing. And we can also do a little more deep packet inspection, but the basic packet filters, which came out a long time ago, the first generation firewalls, basically just looked at that information. And what we do is the packet filter is typically a list of rules based on matches to fields. And as soon as a match hits, it will take the action. And different actions are to permit the traffic, deny the traffic, perhaps we'll log the traffic in the log files, send it to the accounting server. Perhaps if we're doing testing and debugging, we'll capture the information so we can use our Wireshark and look at the traffic. So those are different things we might do with it, but it's all based on access control lists, these filters. We might also prioritize the traffic. If it's a special type of voice over IP, we may give it higher priority. If it's we're doing backups, we might make it lower priority. And we also have a default rule at the end. So if it doesn't match any of our rules, normally the default is to drop the traffic. And we can have different policies and different controls. And when we put those controls into action, we may log some traffic, deny some traffic, accept some traffic, prioritize some traffic, etc., etc. And that's all based on which interface and if it's incoming or outgoing traffic. And the visibility to users diminishes as rules are created. It gets a little complicated to see this, and what you would like to do is have a high-level interface to the firewall so that you can see what's going on easily. And I will say that the Cisco ASA, which all the InfoSec students are allowed to use, just contact me. It has a really nice GUI, and it can show you not only the firewall rules, but it shows you the hits so you can quickly see how many packets are matching the rules. Okay, here we have a table and we have a packet filtering example. So it's a simplified example of a rule set for SMTP traffic, which is email. And the goal is to allow inbound and outbound email traffic, but to block all other traffic. And the rules are applied from the top to the bottom as soon as a match is made. Now, the other problem is if you have hackers and they want to get around your firewall, what do? Well, look, if you look at this, you have destination port. They can just change the port number and they can send email over another port. So instead of using 25, they could just use, well, 25 is accepted, but you have a deny if it doesn't match any of those, but they can just change the port numbers to get around your rules. And to get around your rules by changing the port, it's quite easy. Even if you try to lock down their system, if they use a web browser, they can change the port number very easily. If they want to surf to their home web server, they can just put in the name of their home IP address or the URL, and then at the end put colon and the port number, and that'll change the port. So even if you lock down the computer, they'll still be able to do that. So if you want to solve that problem, we have to have more advanced capability, which is called deep packet inspection or application inspection. Okay, so we're talking about packet filtering firewalls, first generation. So one advantage of a packet filtering firewall is its simplicity, and packet filters typically are transparent to the users and they're very fast. And there are some weaknesses though, and this is the first generation. Because the packet filter firewalls do not examine the upper layer data, the application layer, like the web browser traffic, they cannot prevent attacks that employ application-specific vulnerabilities or functions. For example, a packet filter firewall cannot block specific application commands. And I talked in class about FTP. FTP has a whole bunch of commands, and by doing deep packet inspection, you can disable certain FTP commands and allow others. Same things with web browsing. You could disable certain HTTP commands but allow others. So the packet filter doesn't do that. So if with a packet filter, you either have to accept all the application functionality and protocol or none of it. And again, they can change ports on you and then you won't even know. Attacks and countermeasures. In other words, what is our architecture? A security architecture. With security architecture, you have vulnerabilities, you have attacks, and countermeasures. Now, some of the attacks that can be made on packet filtering firewalls and the appropriate countermeasures are the following. IP address spoofing, and the intruder transmits packets from the outside of the network, like the internet, but they use a source IP address as if it's from your internal network. And the attacker hopes that the use of a spoofed address will allow penetration of systems that employ simple source address security, in which packets from specific trusted internal hosts are accepted. For example, if you have a system, you might have like a host firewall on it and say, I'm going to allow traffic from the local network from this IP address and this and this and this. And if the attacker spoofs those addresses from the internet, they may get through and cause some problems. Now, the countermeasure is what you need to do is configure your firewall to discard packets with an inside source address if the packet comes from the external interface, like from the internet. And this countermeasure is often implemented at the router external of the firewall. So a lot of routers have the same functionality. You just need to configure it. There's also source routing attacks, and the source station specifies the route that a packet should take as it crosses the internet. It's actually like a hop by hop. It says, if you go from here to here, I want to go through this router and then this router and then this router. So they can specify that in the IP packet. And what they're doing is hoping that they can bypass security measures. So if they can route around your firewall and around other firewalls, then they can have a better chance of being successful in exploiting the vulnerabilities. Now, the countermeasure for you is you need to configure your firewall to discard all packets that use this IP option, source routing. There's also a tiny fragment attack, and the intruder can use what's called IP fragmentation. What they do is they break up this big IP datagram into lots of small pieces, and they create extremely small fragments or small pieces and force the TCP header information into a separate packet fragment. And this attack is designed to circumvent filtering rules that depend on the TCP header information, and typically a packet filter will make a filtering decision on the first fragment of a packet. So that would be a way that they can get around that limitation. All subsequent fragments of that packet are filtered out solely on the basis that they are part of the packet whose first fragment was rejected. And the attacker is going to hope that the filtering firewall examines only the first fragment and the remaining fragments are passed through. And this is why you should not accept old routers and old firewalls. You need to have current ones because the current ones will stop this attack as well. Now, a tiny fragment attack can be defeated by enforcing a rule that the first fragment of a packet must contain a predefined minimum amount of the transport header. I left that you can expect it and reject it if needed. So you not only need a current device that supports this feature, but you also have to make sure you configure it. Now, if the first fragment is rejected, the filter can remember the packet and discard all subsequent packets and fragments. Okay, here we have a table and it's example of stateful firewall connection, and this is the next generation of firewalls, not just packet filtering but stateful. Stateful, it remembers the TCP session, for example. Now, a stateful inspection packet firewall tightens up the rules for TCP traffic by creating a directory of outbound TCP connections as shown in this table. There's an entry for each currently established connection. The packet filter will now filter incoming traffic, for example, to high numbered ports, only for those packets that fit the profile of one of the entries in the directory. So the directory is going to control what traffic can go through. If it doesn't match, it's just thrown away. Now, a stateful packet inspection firewall reviews the same packet information as a packet filtering firewall, but it also records information about the TCP connection status. Some stateful firewalls also keep track of TCP sequence numbers, and that will prevent replay attacks. It'll also deny session hijacking. Some even inspect limited amounts of application data for some well-known protocols like FTP, IM, and SIPs, and that's phone, in order to identify and track related connections. So they can even dig down deep into the protocol and figure out if things look correct. And if they don't, then they can go ahead and discard the traffic. We have something called application level gateways. An application level gateway, also called an application proxy, acts as a relay of application level traffic. The user contacts the gateway using a TCP/IP application such as Telnet or FTP, and the gateway asks the user for the name of the remote host that they wish to access. And when the user responds and provides a valid user ID and authentication information, it's the gateway that contacts the application on the remote host, and it relays TCP segments containing the application data between the two endpoints, one on the user and one on the server. If the gateway does not implement the proxy code for a specific application, the service is not supported and cannot be forwarded across that firewall, so it'll drop all other traffic. Further, the gateway can be configured to support only specific features on an application that the network administrator considers acceptable, and it denies all other features. So you can get in there and say, for FTP you're going to allow downloading but not uploading. Now, the application level gateways tend to be more secure than packet filtering firewalls. Rather than trying to deal with the numerous possible combinations that are to be allowed and forbidden at the TCP and IP level, it's the application level gateway that only needs to scrutinize a few allowable applications. In addition, it is easy to log and audit all incoming traffic at the application level. Now, a disadvantage of this type of gateway is the additional processing overhead on each connection. In effect, there's two spliced connections, one between the client and the firewall, one between the server and the firewall, and that's going to cause it to process all of that traffic. So the gateway needs to examine all that traffic and forward it in both ways. But the good news, hardware and software is getting faster and cheaper every year. We have circuit level gateways, and this is a fourth type of firewall, and it's a circuit level gateway or circuit level proxy. This can be a standalone system, or it can be a specialized function performed by an application level gateway for certain applications. As with an application gateway, a circuit level gateway does not permit an end-to-end TCP connection. It's the gateway that sets up two TCP connections, one between itself and a TCP user on the inner side, and one between itself and a TCP server, for example, on the outer side. Now, once the two connections are established, the gateway typically relays TCP segments from one side to the other without examining the contents. The security function consists of determining which connections will be allowed, and once it's allowed, it will not examine the traffic that's going on after that time. Now, a typical use of a circuit level gateway is a situation in which the system administrator trusts the internal users. The gateway can be configured to support application level or proxy service on inbound connections and circuit level functions for outbound connections. In this configuration, the gateway can incur the processing overhead of examining incoming application data for forbidden functions, but does not incur that overhead on outgoing data. An example of a circuit level gateway implementation is the SOX package version 5, and it's specified in RFC 1928. The RFC defines SOX in the following fashion. The protocol described here is designed to provide a framework for client-server applications in both the TCP and UDP domains to conveniently and securely use the services of a network firewall. The protocol is conceptually a shim layer between the application layer and the transport layer, and as such does not provide network layer gateway services such as forwarding of ICMP messages. Now, SOX consists of the following components. The SOX server, which often runs on a Unix-based firewall but doesn't need to. SOX is also implemented on Windows systems. Now, the SOX client library, which runs on internal hosts provided by the firewall, and one of the SOX servers I use runs on Windows. It's free, and it's from bitvise.com. You have SOXified versions of several standard client programs such as FTP and Telnet. The implementation of the SOX protocol typically involves recompiling or relinking the TCP-based client applications or the use of alternate dynamically loaded libraries. However, I found a program called the website is supertunnel.net, and they're able to SOXify applications even though the applications have no code to support SOX, and then it'll work on basically any program. Now, when a TCP-based client, for example, me at work, wishes to establish a connection to some place that I can't get to from work, maybe our work firewall stops it, I could, for example, I don't want to say if I do, I could, for example, connect from my computer at work to my SOX server at home, and then it's going to take the application traffic, send it through that secure encrypted tunnel to my home, and then from my home it hits the SOX server, and then it's going to go out to the internet to all the different places. And that's a way to get around firewalls. So typically it's opening a TCP connection to the appropriate SOX port on the SOX server. And the SOX service is located on TCP port 1080, but you can change that. And if the connection request succeeds, the client, for example me at work, enters a negotiation for the authentication methods to be used, authenticates with the chosen method to my home server, and then sends a relay request. It's the SOX server at my home that evaluates the request and either establishes the appropriate connection or denies it. It even supports UDP. UDP exchanges are handled in a similar fashion. In essence, a TCP connection is open to authenticate a user and to send and receive UDP segments. And the UDP segments are forwarded as long as the TCP connection is still open. So let's talk about a bastion host. And a bastion host is a system identified by the administrator as a critical strong point in network security. So maybe it's the platform for application level or circuit level gateway. And what we want to do is harden that. So the host hardware platform executes a secure version of its operating system, making it a hardened system. So what we do is we disable services that aren't needed. So only the services that the network administrator considers essential are installed on the host. And maybe that's going to be the proxy applications for DNS, FTP, HTTP, SMTP. And that host may require additional authentication before a user is allowed to access the proxy services. In addition, each service requires its own authentication before granting access. So you can have FTP and HTTP. You might want to do an authentication for both. Different users will have access to different protocols, and even within HTTP you can say some users have access to this particular web server and the other users don't. And then each proxy is configured to support only a subset of the standard applications command set. So you can have FTP where they can download files but they can't upload. Each proxy is configured to allow access to specific host systems, you can control which servers are available to which users. This means that limited command feature sets may be applied to a subset of systems. So you might allow users to download from an FTP server, but on another FTP server they can't download, they can only upload. Now each proxy maintains detailed audit information by logging all traffic, each connection, and the duration of each connection. The audit log is an essential tool for discovering and terminating intruder attacks. My advice to you is also make sure you log to a different system. So if they take over the proxy server, they can't destroy the logs. Go ahead and use something like syslog to send it over to your Windows server or a Linux server. You can also use NetFlow. Now each proxy module is a very small software package specifically designed for network security. And it's a very simple program to forward this data. And it's easy to check modules for security flaws because there's not so much code. For example, in Unix mail, you might have 20,000 lines of code, but the proxy for the mail is just like 1,000. Each proxy is independent of the other proxies on the host. And if there's a problem with one proxy, or a vulnerability is discovered, you can go ahead and uninstall that proxy and you don't affect the operation of the other proxy applications. Also, if the user population requires support for some kind of new service, the net admin can go ahead and easily install the required proxy on the host. They don't have to remove the others. And keep in mind, a proxy generally performs no disk access other than to read its initial configuration file. So what we can do is we can mark the file system as read-only. And that's going to also make it harder for the hackers to change the code if they take over the system. Also, each of the proxies runs as a non-privileged user in a private and secure directory on the host, so that if they take over the system via one proxy, they can't cause damage for the other proxies. So you can see we have just so many controls. We have a real hardened operating system. We take away services not used. Even if they take over a proxy, they can't get to another. We got the read-only system. We have a lot of different security aspects on this Bastion host. Let's talk about a host-based firewall. Now, a host-based firewall is a software module used to secure an individual host. And such modules like this are available on many operating systems, and it can be provided as an add-on optional package as well. And they're like standalone firewalls or network firewalls. Host resident firewalls filter and restrict the flow of packets. A common location for such firewalls is a server. I'll talk about PC firewalls next. There are several advantages to the use of a server-based or workstation-based firewall. The rules can be tailored for the host environment. Specific corporate security policies for servers can be implemented with different filters for servers using different applications. Protection is provided independent of the topology of the network. Thus, both internal and external attacks must pass through the firewall. Used in conjunction with standalone firewalls, the host-based firewall provides an additional layer of protection. That's defense in depth. A new type of server can be added to the network with its own firewall without the necessity of altering the network firewall configuration. However, my recommendation is to use network-based firewalls and host or server-based firewalls, and then personal firewalls for the PCs, which I'll talk about soon. Here we are. A personal firewall controls the traffic between a personal computer or workstation on one side and the internet or enterprise network on the other side. Personal firewall functionality can be used in the home environment as well, or on the corporate internets. Now, typically, the personal firewall is a software module on the personal computer in a home environment with multiple computers connected to the internet. Firewall functionality can also be housed on a router that connects all of the home computers to a DSL, cable modem, or internet interface. Now, personal firewalls are typically much less complex than either server-based or standalone. The primary role of the personal firewall is to deny unauthorized remote access to the computer. The firewall can also monitor outgoing traffic in an attempt to detect and block worms or other malware. And I want to add a little bit here. because even though you have personal firewalls on a whole bunch of PCs at a corporate organization, they have software which allows you from an administrator control console to manage and maintain and configure all of these PC personal firewalls. So you don't have to think that the user is actually configuring them. You can have your corporate lockdown, and then you can configure all of the PC firewalls which are personal on each of the devices. Okay, now here's an example of a personal firewall interface. And this example is based on the Mac OS X operating system. And it's a relatively simple utility, and you can turn it on or off. And as I mentioned before, one of the problems is if you turn off your firewall for 1 minute, you can have malware on your computer which is watching and waiting for you to turn off your firewall. And when you turn off your firewall, boom, it starts sending traffic and does all its bad things. Same thing with malware. That's something I haven't read about, but if you turn your malware off for a minute, it can also, the malware on a computer can be waiting for you to do that. And when you do, then it's going to spread its malware and cause its damage. Anyway, back to the slides. If you turn on the firewall, any application, program, or services unauthorized by the system will not be allowed to accept incoming traffic. And any active sharing services such as file sharing, printer sharing are unaffected. In addition, there are 3 options to the user as shown in the figure. You can block all incoming connections, and that'll block sharing services, etc., but it'll allow basic internet connections. If this option is unchecked, then the window below that option lists individual programs and services, and above the line in the window, features of OS X itself are listed. These are features selected by the user in another window. The user can add applications to a list displayed below the line and designate each application as blocked or unblocked. The firewall also allows the user to enable a feature that allows software signed by a valid certificate authority to provide services accessed from the network. Stealth mode hides the Macintosh on the internet by dropping unsolicited communication packets, making it appear as though the Mac is not present. Here we have an example of a firewall configuration. In the figure, it suggests the most common distinction, that between an internal and an external firewall. An external firewall is placed at the edge of the local or enterprise network, just inside the boundary router that connects to the internet or some wide area network. One or more internal firewalls protects the bulk of the enterprise network. Between these 2 types of firewalls are 1 or more network devices in a region referred to as a DMZ, demilitarized zone. Systems that are externally accessible but need some protections are usually located on a DMZ network. Typically, the systems in the DMZ require or foster external connectivity, such as a corporate website, an email server, or a DNS server. The external firewall provides a measure of access control and protection for the DMZ systems, consistent with their need for external connectivity. The external firewall also provides a basic level of protection for the remainder of the enterprise network. In this type of configuration, internal firewalls serve 3 purposes. The internal firewall adds more stringent filtering capability. The internal firewall provides 2-way protection with respect to the DMZ. First, the internal firewall protects the remainder of the network from attacks launched from DMZ systems. Such attacks might originate from worms, rootkits, bots, or other malware lodged on a DMZ system. Second, an internal firewall can protect the DMZ system from attack from the internal protected network. Also, multiple internal firewalls can be used to protect portions of the internal network from each other. For example, firewalls can be configured so that an internal server is protected from internal workstations, and vice versa. A common practice is to place the DMZ on a different network interface on the external firewall that is used to access the internal network. And what you can do, here's my advice, you can also, if you have a whole bunch of DMZ servers, you can put each one on its own segment, and then you can use the firewall between each of the DMZ systems. That'll give you more protection. And here we have a figure of VPN security scenario. In today's distributed computing environment, the virtual private network offers an attractive solution to network managers. In essence, a VPN consists of a set of computers that interconnect by means of a relatively unsecure network and can make use of encryption and special protocols to provide security. At each corporate site, workstations, servers, and database are linked by one or more local area networks. The internet or some other public network can be used to interconnect sites, providing a cost savings over the use of a private network and offloading the wide area network management task to the public network provider. The same public network provides an access path for telecommuters and other mobile employees to log on to the corporate system from remote sites. But the manager faces a fundamental requirement: security. Use of a public network exposes corporate traffic to eavesdropping and provides an entry point for unauthorized users. To counter this problem, a VPN is needed. In essence, a VPN uses encryption and authentication in the lower protocol layers to provide a secure connection through an otherwise insecure network, typically the internet. VPNs are generally cheaper than real private networks using private lines, but rely on having the same encryption and authentication system at both ends. The encryption may be performed by firewall software or possibly by routers. The most common protocol mechanism used for this purpose is at the IP level and is known as IPsec. And the figure is a typical scenario of an IPsec usage. An organization maintains LANs at dispersed locations. Non-secure IP traffic is conducted on each LAN. For traffic off-site, through some sort of private or public WAN, IPsec protocols are used. These protocols operate in networking devices such as a router or firewall that connect each LAN to the outside world. The IPsec networking device will typically encrypt and compress all traffic going into the WAN and decrypt and uncompress traffic coming from the WAN. Authentication may also be provided. These operations are transparent to workstations and servers on the LAN, so you don't have to install anything or configure them. They just work. The idea is the server or client talks in the normal fashion, unencrypted, to the VPN device on its LAN, and then the two VPN devices are the ones who do all the encryption, and that is called a site-to-site VPN. Secure transmission is also possible with individual users who connect into the WAN. Such user workstations must implement the IPsec protocols to provide security. They must also implement high levels of host security as they are directly connected to the wider internet. This makes them an attractive target for attackers trying to attempt to access the corporate network. Let me explain this a little more. The VPN client, like your PC as you're traveling with your notebook, if you want to connect as you move from place to place, that's not a site-to-site VPN normally. I mean, you can do it if you want to do advanced stuff like I do. I run virtual machine in my notebook, and virtual machine is actually a VPN server connecting site to site. But most people, you're just going to run VPN client software, and then from that software you connect to a VPN server and you're good to go. That gets you into the corporate network even though you're traveling, you're on the internet. Now the security problem they're talking about is the following. If someone wants to hack into your company, that might be tough going through your company firewall, etc. But what they can do is they can, via malware, if they can attach malware onto a computer of someone in the company who's traveling, like maybe they're in a hotel or wherever, then when the employee uses VPN to get into the corporate network, the malware that's on their computer can allow access from different devices in the internet to go to that notebook and then through the VPN to the corporate network and attack that way. So that's another vulnerability that we have to think about when we design our security solution. It's another reason for lockdown, where we want to lock down these corporate assets that connect into the network. Now, a logical means of implementing an IPsec is a firewall, and as shown in the figure, if IPsec is implemented in a separate box behind the firewall, then the VPN traffic passing through the firewall in both directions is encrypted. Now, in this case, the firewall is unable to perform its filtering function or other security functions such as access control, logging, or scanning for viruses. IPsec could be implemented in the boundary router outside the firewall, and this device is likely to be less secure than the firewall. So some general advice is traffic from the internet comes in, perhaps it passes a firewall, then it's going to hit the VPN server, it's going to be decrypted, and then it's going to hit another firewall where you can look at the unencrypted data and make more decisions if you're going to filter, log, drop, etc. Okay, now let's talk about a distributed firewall configuration. We may have standalone firewall devices plus server-based firewalls, and they can work under a central administrative control. And in the figure, we can have a distributed firewall configuration, and this way administrators can configure server resident firewalls on hundreds of servers and workstations, and also maybe on configured personal firewalls. And these tools let the network administrator set policies and monitor security across all of these devices. And these firewalls can protect against internal attacks. And internal attacks, you might be thinking, oh boy, at my company, we really trust all the users. The problem is, if they get malware on their computer, you're going to have attacks from within your network. So we need to protect against that. And that's why we have firewalls within our organization, watching traffic internally. Now, standalone firewalls provide global protection, including internal firewalls and an external firewall, as we discussed. With distributed firewalls, it may make sense to establish both an internal and an external DMZ. The web servers that need less protection because they have less critical information on them could be placed in an external DMZ outside the external firewall. And what protection is needed by the host-based systems, we can put on those servers, and we can increase the security for the other servers. An important aspect of a distributed firewall configuration is security monitoring. And this monitoring typically includes logging and aggregation and analysis. We also look at the firewall statistics, and we might look at the fine-grained remote monitoring of individual hosts, which are perhaps more secure if we need to. So we're on to our summary of firewall locations and topologies. So let's go ahead and summarize the discussion. And we'll define a spectrum of firewall locations and topologies. So here are some alternatives. We have host resident firewall. This category includes personal firewall software and firewall software on servers. Such firewalls can be used alone or as part of an in-depth firewall deployment. We have a screening router, a single router between the internal and external networks with stateless or full packet filtering. This arrangement is typical for small office, home office applications. We can have a single bastion inline, a single firewall device between an internal and external router. The firewall may implement stateful filters and/or application proxies. This is the typical firewall appliance configuration for small to medium-sized organizations. We can have a single bastion T, similar to single bastion inline, but has a third network interface on bastion to a DMZ network, where external visible services such as web servers and email servers can be placed. Again, this is a common appliance configuration for medium to large organizations. We can have a double bastion inline. And this configuration, where the DMZ is sandwiched between bastion firewalls, this configuration is common for large businesses and government organizations. A double bastion T, the DMZ is on a separate network interface on the bastion firewall. This configuration is also common for large businesses and government organizations and may be required. For example, this configuration is required for Australian government use. We can have a distributed firewall combination. We talked about that. This configuration is used for some large businesses and government organizations, but it's really not that difficult to set up. So even for smaller companies with 10, 20, 30 users, you may wish to implement it. It all depends on the value of the assets and the risks, and if they're willing to make some investments. But it is not hard to set up even for small companies. And then we have our general summary. And I'll just read through the highlights. We have a need for firewalls, and we talked about the characteristics and the types of firewalls, and we talked about firewall basing, and we talked about the best bastion host, which is really super secure. We can put them on the PCs, personal, on the servers, we can put them on the network. And then we talked about the firewall locations, where you may wish to put them on your network, and we talked about the DMZ and VPNs and distributed firewalls, and that was about it. So thanks for listening. Bye for now.